Ever wonder what really goes on in the world of offshore oil rigs, wind farms, and the energy industry that powers your life? Find the answers to those questions and more on the podcast Wind, Waves, and Wells with Joe. Wind, Waves, and Wells with Joe pulls back the curtain and shares the raw, unfiltered stories from the front lines of energy. From offshore drilling disasters to wind turbine advancements, Joe brings on people who've lived it, worked it, and have the scars or the laughs to prove it. When you tune into Wind, Waves, and Wells with Joe, you'll hear jaw-dropping experiences like being 100 meters underwater with no air, to real conversations about safety, environmental impact, and the politics that don't make it into the brochures. It's insight, storytelling, and sometimes controversy, and always honest. If you're an energy insider or just someone curious about the wild world that keeps the lights on, Wind, Waves, and Wells with Joe is the podcast for you. Available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and wherever you listen to podcasts. Real people, real stories, no filter. Wind, Waves, and Wells with Joe. Start listening right now.
So it's just me this week. Unfortunately, being the day I am, I decided to stay on longer on the current project I'm on. So I had enough podcasts lined up for my original offshore date, but now I've decided to stay longer, which means I'm going to have to do a solo one on my own. So it is shorter this week, which may give you a bit of a rest from my voice. Maybe not so much everyone else's. Far more exciting than me. But I do have a good few lined up when I get back. So I do promise, hopefully, unless this job gets delayed any longer, which I don't think it will, as we are flying through it now, I should have better guests on. But one thing I will speak about this week is that I've started to learn an awful lot about the industry and the divides that seem to be building up within it. Not right across the board. I don't think I can speak for everyone, and maybe I'm looking at it from a more negative approach. So I'm more than happy to take criticism on that front. But I am finding there's a lot of either one or the other, whether it's what we're doing is crazy going after renewables, blah, 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 or whether it's, oil and gas is dead from that side of things. And I think it's really important, and I've seen it a lot within the offshore Europe. I think Offshore Energies did a really good, made a really good example of it, is that we need absolutely everything here in the UK. The idea of shutting down oil fields just to raise our imports, and places like Norway are benefiting off us massively, is, in my opinion, it is stupidity. Now, I know Ed Miliband goes on about, it's based on the international market price, but if we still have reserves in the fields, which we're producing from, and which we know we have more fields of, the likes of Jackdaw, Campbell, why are we so adamant that we have to totally shut down an industry which employs, hundreds of thousands of people across the board, in favor of just importing it from another country, that are benefiting massively, both from the job side of things, economically, and obviously they're making a lot more off the back of us becoming reliant on it. And I think it's the whole globalization thing, which is really starting to take shape, especially in Europe, is we're becoming so reliant on external imports that we're leaving ourselves in a really vulnerable position. Now, I am for renewables. I'm also for oil and gas. I've said this from day dot. But I think one thing that I've realized working in the renewables is not 5 minutes to build a farm. It takes years of engineering, and then it takes years again on top of that of construction. Now, to shut down fields in which there's still life in, and to expect wind farms just to pop up left, right, and centre is total naivety. For example, one of the projects I've worked on, it took 4 years to build. This was obviously in a different country. It took over 4 years to build. It was way behind budget, way behind time. I think it was 2 companies that went bankrupt in the middle of it. These are teething problems. I totally understand that, as the offshore wind is still very much in its infancy, and there's loads to learn from it. But I do think the media narrative around it has to be tidied up, especially from certain perspectives. I think oil and gas from that side of things, the amount of jobs that's been created from it in the long term, is obviously dropping off now due to the fact that the fields are aging, etc., etc. But I think to shut down drilling license opportunities in other fields is, in my opinion, absolute ludicrous. It just does not make sense. It doesn't make sense because we're importing at massive rates now from Norway, who have just issued. I read it the other day. I couldn't tell you. I wouldn't want to lie. A mass amount of new drilling licenses. Now, they are installing new platforms quite often at the moment. I think certain companies, construction companies, are doing really well off them, especially a Dutch one in particular, which I worked for a few years ago. And it just doesn't make sense to not continue with what we have. Yes, we know we've got to hit these net zero targets that everyone's talking about, but places like China, who are obviously leaders in renewable, they're still building coal plants. They're still importing massive amount of oil and looking for their own, drilling for their own oil at a massive rate. So for us to think that our small impact on the world in terms of emissions is going to make a huge difference to the grand scheme, I think it's naivety for a start, and it's economic suicide. And that if there was any time that the Labour government needed to kind of redeem themselves from, obviously that's a totally different story. I'm not going down the political side of things on this. It's an energy podcast, not that, but politics do come into it. If there was ever a time you needed to redeem yourself, it was now. It was a case of going back to the North Sea companies and saying, right, get these licenses, get their licenses out and start drilling again and start opening up, fields again. Because I generally do believe that wind has its position in this place. It really does. I think for remote areas, for example, the one I'm building at the moment is in another country, but their tieback is to quite a remote side of the country, and that particular area will obviously benefit massively off these the tiebacks from this offshore farm. And I think in certain aspects it will work really well. I don't know enough about solar to go into it. I know in the UK there's not that much sun, but I know also that's not how solar panels work and to that extent either. But I just think that the economic approach that we're taking at the moment is going to lead us into a bad place. And I think the other thing it comes down to is the job security and the people at the end of the people that are in these industries. If you just totally eliminate one, where do all those people go? Because I know from my experience, especially on wind, from the construction side of things, is the people that are working on these vessels aren't all from the UK. So when they go to work on UK projects, they go, jobs created, blah, blah, blah. But quite a lot of that is smoke and mirrors, because a lot of these jobs aren't coming to UK people. They're coming from externally. The vessel I'm on now that will be working in the UK next year, I think there's about 3 or 4 British people on it, and it'll be working on one of the biggest offshore wind farms built in the UK. And I think the narrative around that has got to be really cleared up, because yes, it is creating jobs, and yes, it will create more jobs down the line, and you hope that is the case. But the supply chain in the early stages is definitely not from the UK. They're not mass manufacturing the steel from the UK. The cables and stuff, I'm not entirely sure, but I can't imagine they'll be built in the UK either. I'd imagine that'll be somewhere in Italy, etc. But the narrative around this, the whole, renewables creating jobs, etc., that needs to be tidied up massively. It really does, because I've worked all around the world now, and most vessels are multicultural, especially, in the renewables. It's all multicultural. So that has nothing to do, I don't know where I'm going with that. I'm talking, it's different nations is what I mean. I don't know why I said multicultural. That's me. I just woken up on one night shift. But it's different nations that are on board, and that is obviously fantastic for the individuals that are on it. But when you go and sell that narrative to the British public that it's creating XYZ jobs, well, it's a lie. in the face of people that generally believe in that this is the case. But I'm not going to drivel on too much about jobs and stuff like that. But I think the economic factor is something that really worries me here is that, and I spoke about it with Catherine once, and I don't want to obviously bring it up, but if you're going into, the tensions are incredibly high between ourselves and Russia at the moment. For some strange reason, we decided to really, make matters worse by sticking in troops and stuff in Ukraine. But Russia has an unlimited supply, pretty much, of energy. We don't. We're reliant now on other people giving us energy. So we cannot fuel machinery, etc., etc. And there's huge aspects of war in the past, and I hope we don't go to it. But I'm just using this as an example. I don't really know where I'm going with it, to be honest with you. But if you put yourself in that situation, you need to be self-sustainable from the fact that you have the energy in place, you have the manufacturing in place, which we don't have massive amounts of at the moment either. We lost a lot of that in the old days, but we're not self-sustainable is the grand scheme of what I'm getting to. And I think, the narrative around them and us in oil and gas versus renewables needs to be brushed off, because there has to be a combination of the two working side by side to get ourselves to a position where we are basically producing an abundance of energy, and we're at the state of massive decreases in our energy bills. People are able to live a lot better and a lot more comfortably, because at the moment our bills are well, they're not getting any better, and obviously it must mean something if the CEO of Octopus Energy is turned around and says you have to start drilling again. I think that's a classic example of where we are. I know one of the Norwegian ministers as well, a few weeks back I read, has also encouraged the UK to start drilling again. So the writing's on the wall. I think it really comes down to now with how Labour want to approach this going forward. But another thing I've actually been speaking to people about a bit offshore this trip is length of trips and how it's affecting them. Now I'm on week 6 now. It'll be week 6 on Tuesday, Wednesday, and I've got one more week after that, fingers crossed. But that's something that's really coming into play. And I know in oil and gas, the trip stages aren't quite as long, obviously platforms, etc. But one thing that I would be really interested to hear from people is, what is the ideal trip length? We've kind of, from what I've spoken to people, we've come down that it's 4-4 is the ideal number. So yeah, this vessel I'm on, they do 6-6, which I think is far too long. I did 5-5 when I was working for another company, and the 5th week was a bit of a slog. But yeah, 6-6. I'll be doing a 7-week of this. So I've done ridiculously long trips in the past, but I thought I was past them. But it's coming towards the end of the season, and as a contractor, you've got to make hay while the sun is shining in these cases, and that's exactly what I plan on doing. But what is an ideal length of a trip for people? When do they start dropping off? I'd be interested to see if there's ever a study done into it, where you kind of, where your peak is and where your decline kind of starts. Because I think tiredness, obviously, what's going to help me on this trip is I just came on nights, went back onto days, and then I'm back on nights again, which has messed me up quite a bit. But that's what I signed up for. You know what you're getting into when you kind of start the job. But yeah, I'm not going to ramble on too much longer with this episode. I do apologize once again that it's a short one, but to kind of close it up, I really hope that there's some sense seen between the whole oil and gas, wind, renewables debate. I don't think drill baby drill is the way forward. I know Reform have obviously highlighted that. I think they would be a bit naive to pull an approach of that, because writing off renewables will not, I don't think it's going to benefit them in any way, to be totally honest with you. But I do believe getting oil fields up and running is important at the time, until we can find a sufficient energy stability in this country, which we're lacking at the moment. And that's seen right across the board, as you can see in energy bills. But next week, I have got a very good guest coming on, and I'll be recording it pretty much as soon as I get back, and it's actually going to be a really exciting one because it'll be a totally different one. And I'll also encourage people to put their stories in, whether they want to be anonymous or not, because I really do. I would love to have a podcast where I can get someone on and kind of speak about people's experiences from offshore, etc. Because I feel there is plenty of good stories out there, and if you can remain anonymous, I'm sure it'll make it a lot easier for you to send them over. So until then, I do apologize. We're looking like a Sasquatch as well. This is 6 or 7 weeks of no beard cut or haircut. So yes, until the next time, thank you so much everyone who is tuning in week on, week out. The viewings and the downloads have really rapidly increased recently, and it's been really overwhelming to see, and it encourages me to keep this going. And I'm absolutely delighted that people are enjoying the show and reaching out and whatnot. Please let me know if you like it. Yeah, you can let me know if you don't like it, but it sounds like a you problem, not a Joe problem. Until then, have a good one, take care, all the best.